Our final speaker of this session is Antonio Torralba, who's a professor of computer science at MIT, and he'll be talking about network dissection and GANs.
Thank you. So it's supposed to be a counterpoint, so it's going to start with a rant. And basically, one of the things is that deep learning is really an experimental science. No? And for experimental science, what you need is data. And we've been talking about there are people really train with a lot of data, and there is this problem of going to n to infinite, and people saying maybe it's more interesting to study the problem of n going to 1, but really we are stuck right in the middle, okay? We are not going to any of the 2 points, and I think that we need to make a harder effort. In fact, if you look at other fields like physics, they are spending a lot of money to collect the data, okay? They are building these huge things and spending billions of dollars just to connect one data point, okay? And at the end, what it is a ball that is rotating around some other things. How complicated can that be, okay? And what are we doing? Well, we spend just a few cents on mechanical Turk trying to get data about chairs and cars, which I claim are a lot more complicated than the boson Higgs. So, and then what do we do here? So we have all kinds of issues with our data. We are stuck in this middle ground, and our data is actually not very good. How we do build our data sets? Well, we start with a meeting like this one, researchers meet and they start talking about, what is going to be the next feature that they want to build or the next network. And after 1 year, there is a new proposal of a new representation in order to do recognition. And then, Google hired the scientist that proposed the latest breakthrough and implements it on image Google search. And then researchers meet again, they see the results, and they say, oh, we can do much better. So they download the images from Google, they build the next benchmark, and then, they meet again. And there is this circle where we are just feeding ourselves with the same algorithms that is used to generate the data, and then we produce the data, and we train a new algorithm, and so on, and we have no idea where this is going, okay? Eventually, it's going to look like everything works. And there are all these kind of biases that are implicit in our data sets, and we just don't have a very good handle of what they mean. And, we are hiring all these people to do crowdsourcing, and, very rarely we talk about them. So let me talk about one of them. That's my mother, okay? She's been labeling images for the last 10 years, like crazy. And this is her labeling in 2007. This is her labeling in 2018. It's quite possible she is right now labeling images. And she's been labeling like crazy, and we've released a data set that are around 22,000 images that are fully annotated, and we are about to release another set of 20,000 more images. These are full segmented images. And now we use this data to train these algorithms, and this data has all the issues that I was talking about. And this is one mother, okay? So if we had more, I think we could resolve this problem. So, or just give my mother $1 billion. I think she'll label a lot more. Okay, so. And now we are training these systems, and I think that another piece that is missing beyond just understanding the data is also understanding what are the systems doing. And one of the things that I think we are still very poor on are tools to inspect what is going on inside these networks. There are a number of visualization tools out there, but they are not very frequently used. And I think that there are some of them are actually really cool, but the students don't have a good handle on them. And I see my students very often not using these tools as often as they should. And I'm sure that yours are doing the same thing. So what are these networks learning when you train them? So here there are a bunch of things that people have been doing in order to understand what these networks are learning when you train them. And so here is one of the strategies that we propose that is actually pretty similar to how neuroscientists try to understand how the brain works. What you do is you take a network that you have trained to solve a task, and you feed through the network a set of images, and you start checking which units get activated under which images. And this is a strategy that many people have been using. So here there are an example of 3 units. Each row represents 1 unit. The top images, the images that produce the strongest activation in those units. These are 3 units in the last layer right before the output. And you can see that they are doing things that seem pretty reasonable. This network was trained to recognize scenes, saying if something is a bedroom or a conference room or so on. And you can see that there is one unit detecting faces, another unit that seems to be detecting lamps, and it's all a visualization at this point. You don't really have a way of quantifying how good this is. So what we've been working on is on trying to build interpretations of the internal representation that has been learned by the network and try to quantify how good the representation is in order to explain what the network is doing. So for instance, you can take one unit. These are the top images, the images that most strongly activated that particular unit. Because the units are convolutional, you can actually check also which region of the image is responsible of the activation. So you can threshold that activation and you end up with just a part of the image that is the one that really activates that unit. And now, because of all the images that my model annotated, the images that we pass through the network are those images. We have a control of what are the concepts inside those images. So we can just take the segmentation masks, mask it by the unit activation, and just check which concept seems to correlate with that particular unit activation. And here I'm showing objects, but we have all kinds of concepts, colors, low-level features, materials, textures, and so on. And you can just check what seems the unit to be preferring. And you can actually measure how good that concept is by just treating it as a segmentation algorithm and just evaluating the intersection of a union. So that's a score that will range from 0 if it is a really poor object detector, or 1 if it is segmented exactly, the segmentation perfectly overlaps with the mask of the object. So in this case, for the lamp, the intersection of a union is 0.12, which is not a very good score, but actually it will be the type of scores that you would have had if you were training object segmentation algorithm 10 years ago. So it's a pretty good segmentation, given the fact that the unit was not trained to do that. The network was trained to solve another task, which was to recognize scenes. This is something that one of the units has figured out how to do, but it was never being given that particular training. So here there are the images that I was showing before, the units, and now you have an interpretation, and there is a score associated to them. Like, for instance, the last unit, the one in the bottom, doesn't seem to be really doing anything very well, and the highest scoring object in this case is a car, but the intersection of a union is really bad. So this unit doesn't seem to have anything that belongs to our dictionary. It might be doing something else, but it's not a concept in our dictionary. So now we can run this through the entire network and plot histograms of what is going on inside the network. For instance, here, what I'm showing is AlexNet trying to do scene recognition, and the bottom histogram, what it's showing is how many units seem to be tuned to objects in blue, or parts of objects in green, in cyan, or materials in yellow, orange textures, and you see the distribution of different concepts that seem to be emerging in one particular layer inside this network. And you can think of this as a useful way of doing, just checking that your network is converging to something that makes sense. If you can make sense of this interpretation, you have a better idea if your network is properly trained or not. Another important thing is also, when we look at interpretation of networks, it matters a lot the task that we are using to train our networks. Like many times, when we try to make sense of the representation being built, we look at data sets that look like the MNIST data set. It's not a good data set to try to build an intuition of what the network is learning. Because digits like that, they don't really have a very meaningful representation. No. What will be the pieces of the digits that you could form? Junctions, strokes. Each one of us will agree in something different, and it will be very difficult to see if the network is reaching a representation that we identify as something meaningful. Actually, with ImageNet, something similar happens because the final task is about objects, and the intermediate representation might be parts of objects, and there are many ways in which you can break an object, and it will be very difficult to agree in a particular partition that is meaningful. There might be a few parts that have meaning, but there will be many that don't. So I will argue that you need to start looking at tasks that are very high level, like scene recognition or action recognition or captioning, where the task is much, much higher level, and the internal representation might make sense. So here is actually comparing the same architecture and the representation that is built at the exact same layer when you train for scene recognition, so telling what type of place it is, or ImageNet classification. And you can see that there are many more concepts that appear when you train for scenes than when you train from ImageNet. And if you take a network that is being randomly initialized with no training, there are no concepts emerging. So this is not an artifact of the exploration. These concepts are really there. And then you can do interesting things. Like, for instance, you can check how the representation changes from one data set to another. So if you have started training your network with places, and you want to then train it to a different task, a typical strategy is to do fine-tuning. And generally, it's an obscure regularization technique where we don't really know what is going on. It suddenly happens to work, and it's just very amazing. But here you can check what happens with the representation. For instance, when we train for place recognition, there is one unit that seems to be segmenting horses, and now we can check what happens with this concept as you add iterations. So here in this plot, what it will show is the vertical axis is just how good that concept is, so higher is better, and the color will indicate the object that is being discovered, and the name will appear, and then the horizontal axis is the iteration number during the fine-tuning procedure. So it's starting from one task, and then you train it to do a different task. Oops. Okay, well, it didn't happen. So let's see this one here. No, the videos are not playing? Okay, here. Okay, waterfalls. And it turns into dogs. So one of the things that happens is, it's like a dog that has kind of a waterfall inside. And one thing that happens is that ImageNet has a lot of dogs, because that classification task was meant to also contain a fine-grained discrimination task, and there are 20% of the categories within the database that are about dogs. So at the end, when you build the representation, it turns out that half of the objects that are discovered are dog detectors. So then, it's very important that you understand what is going on with the data set to really understand if making sense of the representation makes sense at all. So what happens at the end is that one interesting thing is that objects seem to emerge when you are trying to do place recognition or other tasks. And you can actually play this game with other networks. So here is another thing that is also very amazing that is happening lately, which are GANs that you start with a random vector. It goes through a series of convolutions and expansions until it forms an image, and is trained in this adversarial setting to generate images that should be indistinguishable to a discriminator from real images. And the amazing thing is that these generators are starting to produce really, really amazing images. So here is one of these images that is the result of progressive GAN, which is a really nice image. So this is just trained to generate living rooms. And it just seems very mysterious of what is going on here. And the question is, so you have a lot of data. This is an unsupervised setting because there are no labels associated with these images, just a set of images. And you train a GAN to generate images that look like those. And it works really well. And the question is, how does it do it? Is it building a representation internally that makes any sense? And what does the GAN need to know for it to be able to draw these beautiful images? So here is one hypothesis. So you have this, start with this random vector, you go through a series of expansions, it forms an image, and the question is, are there objects also inside? Will we find units that are really responsible of drawing specific objects? So here we are going to run a very similar idea from the previous analysis of a classifier. So we are still going to play this game of neuroscientists, but now we cannot fit images that we already know what they are. But the nice thing is that the images that this GAN generates, they are so realistic that you can actually run a segmentation algorithm, and it segments those images, is able to recognize the objects quite reliably. So what we'll do is we take the GAN, we take one unit in one of the layers, we look at, for whenever it's generating one particular image, like in this case here, we look at the activation map of that unit. Each unit is a convolutional map, so it's going to have an energy landscape over the image. We look at that feature map, and now we take an automatic object segmentation algorithm. We run all possible classes. We segment all possible classes with this image, and we check which segmentation seems to best overlap with a thresholded version of this energy landscape of the activation of that particular unit. So in this case, and we can then measure, as before, the agreement between the two as just intersection over union. So if you have a segmentation that really matches the activation map, you'll get a very high score, and then you could check maybe that unit is actually responsible of that particular object being drawn. And indeed, what happens is that indeed we find that there are units that are responsible for drawing specific objects. So, for instance, when you learn to synthesize dining rooms, there is one unit that activates with windows. Whenever that unit is activated, a window appears. There is another one that it gets activated that activates tables. So if that unit is activated, a table appears. And you can draw the same thing. You can now build these histograms of the different things that you find in a particular layer within the GAN. And you can check actually what happens across all the layers. And what we see is something that you will expect. When you are very close to the random vector, you only generate coarse layout properties of the scene. When you are very close to the image, it's all about the edges and the colors and the small details, and it's in the middle where we find most of the object classes. So now we can do all kinds of tricks. For instance, you can take an image generated by this GAN, you can deactivate the window units, and it removes the windows and paintings appear instead. Or here there is a scene, there is some people, you remove the people units, just deactivate them, and the people disappear. Here is another example where you have this kitchen. We will activate the window units just on that region, and a window appears. Even puts the reflection on the counter. We can actually identify units that seem to be responsible of mistakes of the image generation process. So we can deactivate them and generate a normal image. And we have an algorithm, a tool that allows you to play with this and start generating images in many ways. So one cool thing is that you can have this thing, you can activate the door units here, and it puts a door. Interestingly, if you try to draw a door on the sky, it doesn't let you do it. So this is like the paint algorithm, or imagine using Photoshop, and here you're trying to put something, and the network knows better than you that you shouldn't be drawing this thing there, okay? So I will let you do just with this video, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. That was fantastic.